Hey guys, it's Mr. Whitman. Back at it again with another one of these videos that none of you are watching, but it is what it is. Today, what we're going to talk about is lesson 3, and that's going to be on the Holocaust. It's going to be probably the darkest point of human history that people actually talk about, that's actually discussed in everyday vernacular at this point. The Holocaust is going to be something that um, I would like to say will never happen again, but there's been things that have happened since that have been kind of compared to the Holocaust. It's going to be an event in human history that's going to coin the term genocide, which means that the extermination of an entire race of people. And there's going to be different various genocides throughout history. And this is going to be the most famous one happening in World War II. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Of course, on the left is going to be your learning objectives. So it's going to be identify the roots of Nazi persecution of the Jews, describe how the Nazis carried out the program of genocide, describe the various acts of Jewish resistance, and to summarize the response of the Allies to the Holocaust. Okay, these are going to be the 4 key terms. I'm pretty sure you've heard of all four of these words. You know, the concentration camp, Holocaust, crematoriums, and the most famous concentration camp of them all, Auschwitz. So let's get started. So the Nazi campaign against the Jews, right? So how does this all start? So the Hitler came to power in the midst of the Great Depression, promising to end reparations, create jobs, and defy the hated Versailles Treaty by rearming Germany. Hitler also played on anti-Semitism, which had existed for centuries in Europe. Hitler saw Jews as a separate, inferior race whom he blamed for Germany's defeat in World War I. He launched a campaign against the Jews, which began with persecution and escalated to mass murder. So when we start talking about World War II, which it sucks that we don't have the time to do it in class because I would dedicate like 2 months to this if I could. Hitler comes to rise after World War II. He comes to rise after the Great Depression, right? After the Depression hits the entire, not just the United States, but it hits all of post-war post-World War world, right? So everyone's affected by this. Germany is going to get hit especially hard because of all the restrictions placed on them by the Treaty of Versailles. So Hitler's going to rise to prominence in politics by blaming certain things, right? He's going to blame France. He's going to blame France for the treatment that they're given. Excuse me. They're going to think that they're getting treated unfairly for the results of World War One. And he's going to go ahead and use a very popular scapegoat, especially in Europe, and that's going to be Jews, people of the Jewish faith. Jews are going to be persecuted throughout history, just flat out, forever. They've always been persecuted, especially in Europe. They're going to be driven out of their homes. They're going to become nomadic whenever they finally are able to set somewhere and actually call it a home. They repeatedly throughout history get driven out of that, that home state. So the Jews are an easy target, especially if you're trying to place blame on somebody, because the Jewish people are going to be like another group of people that we're going to talk about in this chapter. The Roma, which are gypsies, right? What we call as gypsies. It's not a really good word to call them. They're actually classified, they're called Roma due to where they're from, Rome, initially. But they're going to be very, very disestablished. Now, what do I mean by that? They're going to be a group of people who aren't going to be highly represented, especially then. Throughout Europe, they're not going to really have anyone sit at the table, so to speak, to talk about their problems. People are just going to assume and step over them and not really ask for their opinion or for their help. So to go back to Hitler, when Hitler's rising up the ranks in Germany, he finds an easy scapegoat to blame all of Germany's problems on. He says, well, blame it on the Jews because that's what people have been doing for hundreds of years. And he does. And the Jews aren't really able to defend themselves in the public eye because they don't have representation because they're a very small group of people. So eventually it's going to start with just simple persecutions, which we'll talk about, and it's going to escalate extremely quickly to mass murder and genocide. So the four parts of this chapter we're going to talk about are going to be the early persecution, the Nazi concentration camps, brutal medical experiments, and Hitler's final solution. So early prosecution. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 put Nazi racist ideology into practice. They removed citizenship from German Jews and banned marriage between Jews and non-Jews. Before long, the Nazis imposed other restrictions to force Jews from their jobs and homes and embarked on escalating violence and terror against Jews. Anti-Semitic propaganda triggered one of the most violent early attacks on Jews and on people in general. In November of 1938, Nazi-led mobs smashed windows, looted and destroyed Jewish homes, businesses, and places of worship. This wave of violence in Germany and Austria became known as Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. So crystal, right? It sounds like crystal, like glass, and Nacht means night. So let's get started with the Nuremberg laws. When the Nazis start getting more and more political influence, because class, we have to remember that they start off as a political party, not much different from like Democrats, Republicans, or like the Whig Party, things that we've talked about in class. They're going to be a very extreme version of conservatives that want, specific things in mind. And their rhetoric, their sentiment is going to become very popular, especially in Germany. So when eventually enough of them come into power and they start taking over German parliament, what they're going to do is they're going to go ahead and pass the Nuremberg laws. And this is going to be the very beginning of kind of dehumanizing and getting rid of just basic rights to Jews, who are people, right? Just like me and you, they're normal people. They have jobs, normal jobs. They have normal businesses. But the Germans are going to start taking that away. And the first thing they start doing is they ban the marriage between Jews and non-Jews. What they really think they're doing by doing this is they're keeping the Nazis have a very, I don't know how to say this. The Nazis have a very simple view on race. It's either you're pure or you're not. There's no in between. So for example, I'm Mexican American. I'm half white, half Mexican. My mom's Mexican, like I've told you guys before, from Mexicali, and my dad's white from India. So I wouldn't be considered pure, right? So what they would do is, hey, you're a non-pure person. You're not one or the other. You're not allowed to marry and have children, right? You're not allowed to mix up the gene pool, so to speak. So that's what they're going to try to accomplish by disallowing the marriages between Jews and non-Jews. And because they don't want them mixing with the general population. And before long, right, like it says here, Nazis impose other restrictions. So what they're going to do is they're going to find like excuses for them to get rid of their jobs. Now, a lot of the general population, the people who are supporting the Nazi ideologies, are going to support this because who's taking their jobs, right? So, for example, class, if you have someone like yourself, right, let's just pretend it's you. If you have a really good, high-paying job, right, let's just say you have a really good job. Let's say you're a teacher like me, right, and I'm Jewish. And all of a sudden, just because I am Jewish, I'm not allowed to have this job. So somebody who doesn't deserve it necessarily, right, because, before all this, the person who got the job was the person who deserved it the most, right? They were either the qualified the best, they went to school the most, or whatever, right? They were just better at their job. So as soon as that person gets kicked out of that job, now who replaces them, right? The people who are replacing them, the people who are benefiting from this, are usually the ones that are supporting the Nazis. So of course you're going to want to support something that is indirectly, because they're not doing it for you, right? They're indirectly helping you, putting you in a better situation. Right, so that's how a lot of people are going to be able to justify, right, this racist ideology. So when we talk about Kristallnacht, right, we need to talk about, right, what it is. So Kristallnacht is going to be a result of a lot of propaganda. The propaganda is going to be a German media kind of not invention, because it's a very ancient idea of trying to persuade people for your favor, right? But they're going to go ahead and push propaganda to the max. So they're going to be able to print out tons of copies of these posters and post them everywhere. And here they're going to blame the Jews for literally everything, right? And a lot of it's going to be unclaimed. A lot of it's going to be unfounded, right? So for here, right, they're going to blame the Allies, which are the British, U.S., and USSR, right? They're going to blame that really the Jews are behind it, right? They're the ones pulling the strings in as the Allies, right? So of course we have to hate the Jews because they're the ones who are fighting against us. And then here they're blaming the Jewish population on typhus, which is a disease given by lice that is deadly. When in reality, right, there wasn't enough of that population to give or start anything, period, right? They're just going ahead and blaming everything that's bad on these people. And then eventually it's going to boil over and this sentiment is going to reach a fever pitch. And what that's going to be the night of broken glass is literally mobs going around, especially in Germany and Austria, and they're going to be going around and just shattering windows and destroying businesses and looting and setting churches and places of worship on fire. And a lot of the people aren't going to care, and actually a lot of people are going to be for it. Right, you're going to have people like this guy here like smiling, this girl here smiling at the destruction, at the loss of people's livelihood. Right? These people's businesses are gone. They have nothing to turn back to. If that makes any sense. So when this happens in this country, right, a lot of the people who is affected by this, right, a lot of the Jewish people are going to say, hey, well, that's not okay, right? We got to do something about it. But are they going to be allowed to do anything about it by the government? Well, no, not necessarily, because the government's the one that's kind of egging it on and saying, oh, actually, it's not that bad deal, right? When in reality, it's terrible, it's awful, it's disgusting, right? But the government isn't going to back them up, and they're not going to know where to go, right? Are they going to be able to go anywhere? And that's really what we need to start talking about when we talk about the Jewish Holocaust, right? So as you can see the role of propaganda, they're going to be blamed for everything, and they're going to kind of brainwash the public into thinking, right, that they're the ultimate bad guys, right? Like they're responsible for everything bad that's ever happened to Germany. When in reality, that's not true at all. And it's going to lead to the building of these Nazi concentration camps, right? So let's start talking about what those are for a little bit. After gaining power in 1933, the Nazis began rounding up political opponents and placing them in concentration camps, which are detention centers for civilians who are considered enemies of the state. Before long, they were sending Jews, communists, and others they despised to these camps. Hitler had given Heinrich Himmler the power to take full control of these camps throughout the war. As World War II began, the Nazis built many more camps for Jews from Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe. They started targeting resistance fighters, Roma, Slavs, and other racially undesirable elements. Okay, so what they did initially, what the Nazis did initially was they would start building these concentration camps or like these work camps or, forced labor camps. And what they would do is they would take people, usually political dissidents or like people who are going against them politically, political enemies, and they will arrest them on phony charges and put them in prison pretty much. They would make up reasons for them to go to prison. They would call them communists, and they would send them to jail, right? In this version of jail where they would have to work. And usually the beginning, it was like going to jail where you have a sentence and then when you're done, you leave. And then usually, right, you get beaten so much that you stop or you start talking about Nazis differently. So for example, like if you're a writer for a newspaper and you're writing critically about the Nazis or you're writing in opposition of the Nazis, what they'll do is they'll arrest you, they'll beat you, send you to the Nazi concentration camp. After 2 years or whatever, 6 months or whatever, you would come back and you would be changed, right? You wouldn't want that again. So you would stop writing about them, or you would write, now you're writing glowingly about them. Now you're writing about how good they are. And that was really a political tool that they used, right? Initially, at first. And then it turned into something different when they took over Poland. When they would eventually invade Poland, they inherited a bigger population of Jewish people. Now, what do I mean by inherited? When they took over Poland, right, they take over the entire population of the country. And the population of that country had a smaller population of Jewish people. Well, that small population was just too much for Hitler and his fellow Nazis. So what he did was he relinquished the power of these concentration camps. So he was no longer the one running them, so to say. He gave all that power to his right-hand man, Heinrich Himmler. Now, Heinrich Himmler is going to use this and kind of implement his sick and twisted ideology onto the people that he's going to put in these camps. So what people don't really realize is when Hitler was rising to power, he doesn't have this intense hatred for Jews, right? He writes about them a lot in Mein Kampf, which is his book that he writes when he's in jail before he rises up politically. But he's going to blame some things on them, but he's not going to want them all dead. He's not going to want them all murdered, if that makes any sense. He's racist, but not a sociopath, right? Not yet, right? It's not going to be until Heinrich Himmler comes into the picture, and he's going to have this racial ideology of like this Aryan race, right? All that Aryan stuff is in, white superiority and this idea of being Aryan and having perfect blood and having, historically great features and all of this stuff, right? Being superior in some way is going to come from Heinrich Himmler. So when he takes control of these concentration camps, he views this as an opportunity to get rid of the Jewish problem, right? The quote unquote Jewish problem. And when we talk about concentration camps, class, we need to realize that they are not in Germany. Initially, some of the camps that started were, but the big concentration camps are not going to be in Germany. And there's reasons for that we'll talk about. So like I said, class, after World War II began, the Nazis built many more camps for Jews from Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe. So whenever they started gobbling up more and more of these countries and their populations, what they would do is they'll round up the Jews. They'll go into town and say, hey, who are the Jews here? They would take them all, put them on a train, and send them to Poland, right? Initially, right, it wasn't just the Jewish people. They started going after Roma, who are, what you would call a gypsy, people of Slavic nationality, so pretty much people who are like kind of Russian, and other racially undesirable elements. So what that means is people who are crippled, people who are blind, not necessarily black, because there wasn't a lot of black people in Europe at the time who would be considered like European. So they weren't really targeted, but they would target people who weren't considered normal, right? So if you're a minority in any way, then you would be likely taken care of and sent to a concentration camp. So class, these are going to be the four major concentration camps that we're going to talk about today. So the first one is going to be Treblinka, all the way to the northeast. Warsaw is going to be the capital of Poland, right? There's not going to be a concentration camp there. There's not going to be in the city. They're all going to be in the middle of nowhere, in the woods, where there's no one around. Now, there's a reason for that. But before we go, let's go talk about the other ones. To the east, all the way to the east, are going to be Sobibor and Belzec. These are going to be the two smaller ones. And then you're going to have Auschwitz, which is going to be the closest one to Slovakia and the Czech Republic. Auschwitz is going to be the most famous one. Auschwitz is where a lot of the more medical, like just the absolute nightmares of nightmares are going to be taking place in Auschwitz. I believe 1.6 million Jewish people were actually admitted into Auschwitz, and 1.1 million died there. They never left. Treblinka was even more. However, these four are going to be considered the killing centers, right? If you get sent to any of these four camps, chances are you have like a 95% chance you're going to die. This is where they weren't necessarily labor camps in terms of, okay, we're putting you in a factory and you're going to make us bombs, right? Like a labor camp where you put it to work. Here, these four is you're sent there to die. And there's a reason why they're so far away from the city. Well, the reason for that is because the Germans are going to be monsters, but they don't want to be seen as such. So they want to keep all of this killing and all of this genocide away from major populations. They don't want to be viewed as monsters by their own people, because there's a difference between not liking and having prejudice. There's a difference between being racist, and there's a difference between seeing people get burned alive and not doing anything about it, right? There's a difference between that. So as the Germans are, they're anti-Semitic, and they wish harm upon Jewish people. There's a difference between that ideology and seeing, like I said earlier, right, seeing families get literally burned to ash, right, and systematically decimated. So the Germans are going to do a good job of keeping that in the shadows, really. The people aren't going to really question what's going on or where these people are going. They're just kind of out of the way, right? Out of sight, out of mind. They're going to stop thinking about them. But yeah, so there's a reason why all of these death camps are not in Germany, are not next to Warsaw, right? They're out of the way, out of the middle of nowhere, so that people can't find them and people can't see the horrors and nightmares that are happening. So let's talk about some of the brutal medical experiments. In some camps, Nazi doctors conducted painful and deadly medical experiments on prisoners. They test dangerous new drugs in prisoners and trailer treatments designed to help Axis forces survive injuries. They also write experiments to try to prove Nazi racial ideas. So there was a couple of typos in there. So what they try to do in a lot of these, especially in Auschwitz under this guy right here, Joseph Mengele, is that they're going to try to recreate battle situations to see and really push the limits on the human body. It's going to be just torture, really. So let's talk about a little bit more about Joseph Mengele. He's going to be a physician at the notorious Auschwitz concentration camp, conducting experiments to see how different ethnic groups respond to contagious diseases such as malaria or yellow fever. Still, other experiments were linked to the Nazi goal of sterilizing people they claimed were inferior races. So to go back to the idea of keeping that gene pool clean, he's going to try to find a way, right? Because this is going to be part of Hitler's like solution to the problem was, we'll make it so that they can't have kids, right? That way, it just eventually they just stop existing. And so that was a very interesting thing that they were very interested in. Not interesting thing isn't, it's not interesting at all. It's terrible, but it's something that interested them. So what they would do is they would inject people's sexual organs with chemicals and chemically castrate them, and just a whole bunch of just terrible things. And one of the things that they did was they would take racial groups. So for example, they would take a group of Slavs from a village, and they would keep them contained. They would keep them contained in a building, and they would give them smallpox, right? They would give them yellow fever, malaria, and then they would go in and write to see how long they would last. They would see how it affected them, to see if there was a difference between how malaria would kill them compared to killing white people from Russia or other German Jews, or right. They would try to experiment on these people, and they're dying, right? And that was the plan. They wanted them to die, but they were trying to get insightful information that they thought was insightful, when in reality it really wasn't. So for example, in Auschwitz, what they would do is he would initially I wanted to show you guys pictures. I wanted to give you guys videos, but I can't handle that right now with everything going on mentally. And I don't think you guys can either. So I didn't. So if you guys want to watch really graphic documentaries, you guys can find them yourself. I'm not going to really go into that much detail, but for example, what Joseph Mengele was really interested in doing was pretty much playing God, right? He was a surgeon who would try to, I'm pretty sure you've heard these stories, right? He would inject not Clorox, but he would inject chlorine into people's eyes to see if he could change their eye color from brown to blue, right? Which would result in being blinded. He would get sets of twins, and he would cut them in half upwards and try to sew the opposites together to see if they would survive. And he would try open heart surgery and try to surgically switch their their heart or their brain, or just absolute nightmare fuel. And of course they all failed, because he was just a butcher. He would just kill all these people with no remorse. And Joseph Mengele is going to be nicknamed the Angel of Death for a reason. Whenever he would show up to the camp, if you read books about it, he's in Night, where he talks about seeing him and just the dread and fear people had of him, because they knew if he was in the camp that day that he's going to conduct these experiments And the people who did survive some of these experiments, right, the horror stories that they would tell, and it's just absolute nightmare. So Hitler's final solution. By 1941, Hitler and fellow Nazis devised what they would call the final solution to the final solution to the Jewish question. Their goal was the extermination of all European Jews. This campaign of genocide eventually became known as the Holocaust. Hitler took steps to carry out his final solution after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Mobile killing units followed the German army and murdered over 1 million Jewish men, women, and children in Eastern Europe. When I was in college, I had to write about these mobile killing squads, right? In German, it's called Einsatzgruppen. Now, what they were a group of men who were never German, right? They were never German. There were always people taken from the towns or the villages that they invaded. And what they would do is they would say, hey, we either kill you or we give you a gun, you follow us, and then you kill who we tell you to kill. So it's a very, very graphic, monstrosity of the human condition, where people would, it's either I die or I kill to survive. And eventually the burden got so big. So what they would do is really, they would be the ones that were in charge of whenever they would go into a town, right? What they would do is they would go into a town. For example, let's say the Nazis are coming through and they're invading and they're making their way in California, or they're making their way up to San Diego or LA or something, right? And they're driving through Calipat. What they would do is, what they would do is they'd come in, right? They would go into the town square and they'll say, hey, you're now under Nazi occupation. There's no one here fighting us. You're now part of a German state. You're now part of the German Empire, right? Because there's no one trying to fight us. They invaded. They occupy us now. So what they would do is they would go ahead and they would go to the town centers and they would look at records and they'll try to find a list, usually a list of who the Jews were in that town. And what they would do is they would go to that town hall and they'll round up, about 6 or 7 men and say, hey, we're going to kill you unless you get these people, right? And when we leave, you have to get rid of them one way or another. You have to go in there and murder them, right? You have to kill them. And when we come back and they're still alive, then we kill you, right? So it's really having them turn on different people. And eventually that didn't work, right? Eventually people aren't going to kill their neighbors. Eventually they're going to fight back. So when that didn't work, what they would start doing is they would start taking soldiers from their allies, right? Their allies, the other Axis parties. So a lot of Polish soldiers, they would take a lot of Austrian soldiers. And what they would do is they would go ahead and just do that all day. And when you're researching this, you start to realize how much how much that affects you, how much that ruins you, because what they would do is really, they would take them into a ditch and then just shoot them in the head. And the people, you can't do that, right? As a person, as a human, mentally, you can't just shoot someone in the head over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So really, these mobile killing squads got more and more and more and more and more effective at doing it, so that they wouldn't mentally lose it. So of course there was a lot of suicides happening in these units. So a lot of the people couldn't handle killing people like this anymore, so they would commit suicide, right? They just couldn't do it. So the Germans figured out ways to exterminate Jews without it affecting the mental health of the people killing them. Now what they would do is they would make, right, like these trailers and these trucks and pretty much make like these mobile gas chambers, right? So they'll round up, let's say 10 men, they'll throw them in the back of a truck. They would park it, they would lock the door, they would leave, right? The Nazis would leave. And then as the car is on, the truck or the tank that the people are in will eventually fill up with gas and they'll die. And then the men will come back wearing masks, and they would take the bodies out, they would clean it up, and then on to the next town, right? So they weren't actively killing them anymore. They were dying while they were gone, and they didn't feel that sense of he didn't pull the trigger, right? He just left. So they didn't face that much guilt, but it was still very tough on the soldiers. And a lot of the time these units were constantly just being like replenished. So for example, like a group of people would only have that job for like a month, and then they'll go do something else because they just physically, mentally couldn't do it. They mentally couldn't handle doing that, especially when it came to the women and children, right? That'll ruin a person, having to do that to somebody. The Nazi campaign against the Jews. Guys, go ahead and read this. I'm going to go ahead and skip it. So here's going to be a picture of just a labor camp, right? Not a death camp, right? This not Treblinka or Auschwitz, right? But this is going to be what it looked like to be in a labor camp, concentration camp early on. And ultimately, this is going to be the size, just the absolute size of, and the amount of just scope of Nazi concentration camps, right? This is going to be the height. This is going to be all of them, right? So of course, right, a lot of the labor camps, as you can see, they're green. A lot of them are going to be in Germany, right? Because when you're driving by a labor camp, right, kind of looks like a prison. People working, people doing things. Not driving by. People aren't driving by, right? But they can be around populations. What I'm trying to say. That's why if you look at the death camps, right, they're all in Poland, right? They're all in Poland. They're all away from the cities, for a reason, right? For a reason. So Jewish resistance, right? While all of this was happening, right, the Jewish people weren't just giving up, right? They were resisting. Right? Jewish people resisted the Nazis even though they knew their efforts could not succeed. In early 1940s, Jews in the ghettos of Eastern Europe at times took up arms. The largest uprising occurred in the Warsaw Ghetto in occupied Poland. So class, real quick, a ghetto is a community, right? It's like a barrio, right? It's a community, it's a neighborhood, it's a block, right? It's a part of a town. So Warsaw is a city. The ghetto is where all the Jewish people lived, right? And that's what a ghetto is. So we're going to talk about those three things, right? The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, continuing resistance, and hiding Jews. So the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. In July of 1942, the Nazis began sending Polish Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka death camp and slave labor camps. As mass deportations continued, Jewish groups organized an underground resistance movement. By the spring of 1943, the Germans planned to liquidate the Warsaw Ghetto was clear, and resistance groups planned a full-scale revolt. Armed with smuggled weapons and homemade bombs, the Jews took over. Why is it girl? Ghettos and prepared to fight to the end. Sadly, they were quickly killed. Although this uprising was doomed, the courage of the resistance inspired uprisings everywhere. So he talks about it in the book Night, which you guys will be reading for Miss Velas's class. He is from Warsaw, right? He is from Warsaw, so you have a very good understanding of what that was like. So as the Jews were coming into the town, what they would do is they would fence it off. So, right, imagine if there's like 5 city blocks, they would go ahead and put fences up around the blocks. And then slowly but surely, German troops would come in and they'd go apartment building to apartment building or house to house. And they'll say, hey, are you these people? They'll read the names out loud. You would say yes. They'll say, okay, tomorrow a train's coming. You need to get on the train. And if you don't, we'll take you and put you on the train. So then the next day, the people will go, they'll line up at the bus station or the train station. They'll get on the trains, and the trains are shipping them to Treblinka or Auschwitz or Sobibor or, wherever, usually to a death camp. Now, as people, right, but however, class, this took a long time. This took about, there was a couple months where this was happening because not everything was happening daily. Eventually, word got back to Warsaw of what was happening to the people that left, about how they were just getting massacred and they're putting them in gas chambers. And so, the people living in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Jews there, they wanted to fight back, and they did. And it almost worked. It almost worked, except for, there's an actual army of Nazis, right? And Warsaw is just a group of resistance fighters. And it was failed. It was doomed. However, the courage inspired uprisings elsewhere, and it became a really big deal about, right? It became a big deal for Jews everywhere. They were martyrs. They were saying, hey, if they can fight, we can fight too. And they did, right? And it became a very, a pain on the backside of the Nazis. Now, continuing resistance. If the few Jews escaped the Warsaw ghettos and from ghettos elsewhere in Eastern Europe, right? A few of them did survive. A few of them were able to flee. About 25,000 Jews, many of them teenagers, joined a resistance group waging guerrilla warfare against the Nazis throughout Eastern Europe. These fighters were called partisans. Now, these partisans, what they would do is if they were, if they had connections, if they were able to leave, if they were able to escape with their lives, they had nowhere to go. And the only places they could go is they could go and join opposition groups, right? They could say, hey, we'll feed you, we'll give you clothes, we'll protect you as long as you're fighting with us. And it's, they're fighting guerrilla warfare. We've talked about what guerrilla warfare is before, right? But they're going to go ahead and join, right, these Eastern European guerrilla groups. Jewish resistance took different forms. In addition to the uprisings and fighting with guerrilla forces, some chose to challenge Nazi death camps themselves. Uprisings occurred at Treblinka and Sobibor. In October 1944, a group of Jews in Auschwitz, the largest Nazi death camp, destroyed one of the gas chambers, right? That was actually successful, and it slowed down the annihilation a little bit. Yeah, 1 million people still died in that camp, but which is unfathomable. When you say 1 million people, like, it puts you into perspective how much 1 million people is. That's like all of Mexicali, right? Think of it that way. That's entire city gone, like that, gone. So people, there's famous stories that you'll read when you get older of people that would break into these death camps, right? They would break into Auschwitz, into Treblinka, and they would give weapons, right? They would break in and break out when people weren't really paying attention. They're really, really good at doing this. Famously, there was a writer, he was an English writer for one of the English newspapers at the time, who heard about rumors of Auschwitz, and he broke into Auschwitz, and he took people's, stories. He wrote people's stories. He took pictures, and then he was there for like 3 months, and then he was able to escape. The same way he broke in, he broke out, and he wrote the stories in Britain. And we're going to see how those stories were really taken, right? So hiding Jews. So the people who couldn't fight, well, they hid. In some parts of Europe, friends, neighbors, or even strangers protected Jews. When Mussolini undertook a vicious campaign against Italian Jews, peasants hid Jews in the villages. They hid them in basements, in rooms, in closets, right? We've all read Anne Frank. We know who Anne Frank is. An entire family and a half, right? Like 2 families, they hid in an attic, right? They hid in an attic for months, years, I believe. Right? Denmark and Bulgaria saved almost all the Jewish populations. The Danish resistance movement, assisted by common citizens, coordinated the flight of over 7,000 Jews to safety in nearby Sweden. Many non-Jewish individuals took great risks to save Jewish lives. Most people, however, closed their eyes to what was happening. Many people cooperated with the Nazis, actively taking part in killing Jews or informing on Jews in hiding. In France, the Vichy government helped ship thousands of Jews to their deaths. Strict immigration policies in many Western countries blocked Jewish immigration. So class, one more time, the Vichy government is the government, it's like the puppet government that the Germans have in France, right? So it's the French government, which is controlled by the Germans. So the reason why a lot of these Jews had to hide and they couldn't flee to other countries was because there was really strict immigration policies. Especially during the Depression, right? A lot of people didn't want immigrants, and we'll talk about why. Right, so this is the picture of the German uprising. The entire civilian population of the Warsaw Ghetto was expelled. Most were sent to labor and death camps, right? Most of the people in that city were, right, the Jewish people in that city were put to death. The Allies' response to the Holocaust, right? Even before the war started, some people outside Germany expressed concern about the Nazi persecution of the Jews. Still, the response was limited. The United States and other countries could have accepted many more Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria. Now, did they? No, let's talk about these four things. The question of Jewish refugees, the Allies take limited action, the liberation of the concentration camps, and the impact of the Holocaust. So we're almost finished, class. The question of Jewish refugees. In the summer of 1938, delegates from 32 countries met in France to discuss the refugee problem, quote unquote. During the meeting, delegates expressed sympathy for the refugees, but most countries, including the United States and Britain, offered excuses for not accepting more refugees. In the midst of the Great Depression, many Americans worried that refugees will take jobs away from them and overburden social welfare programs. Sound familiar? Right. Widespread racial prejudices among the Allies, including anti-Semitic attitudes, also played a role in the failure to admit more Jewish refugees. Class, the Germans weren't the only people who are racist. Straight up, right? People didn't want Jews in America, right? The Congress didn't want more Jewish people in America. People didn't want refugees. Britain, right? Britain did a good job, but even the people that they accepted were not everybody. Right. Yeah, not everybody. Perfect example. The British Empire did not take adults. They did this thing which was good because it saved their lives, but it was also, really weird that a lot of Jewish families, not Jewish families, I'm sorry, well, a lot of British families would take Jewish children, kind of like foster care. But they did it selfishly. They'll say, well, I don't want to take care of the family, but I'll take the kids, right? A lot of people would use this as a form of adoption. Weirdly, it did save lives. Thousands of Jewish children were able to go to Britain, but they had to be separated from their family. They couldn't be with their family. They had to be separated. A lot of these kids would never see their families after this. Never see their families after this. So, it was a very traumatic experience for a lot of those kids. But class, we have to remember one thing, class. America also refused. Famously, there was a ship full, I believe it was 7,000 Jews were on a ship called the St. Louis that sailed to, I believe, New York. And as they got into Ellis Island, they were asked who they were, what they were doing there. And when they said that there were Jewish refugees from Germany, the American forces, America pretty much told them to go back home, go back to Germany. We don't want you. And those Jews, right? Do you think they survived when they got back home? What do you think happened to them? So, right, a lot of these countries were not necessarily explicit, but a lot of them kind of turned a blind eye, as you can see here, right? The Allies knew the Jews were being taken to death camps, right? This is 1942, right? They knew they were going to death camps in Poland, but often kept this information classified. They refused to release early photographs taken of the camps. Over the next 2 years, both Britain and the United States considered the idea of bombing Auschwitz, but neither country took action, focusing instead on the ultimate war aiming to defeat the Nazis. President Roosevelt began to respond to reports of Jewish genocide in 1944. He established the War Refugee Board, a government agency that worked with the Red Cross to save thousands of Eastern European Jews. Overall, the War Refugee Board is credited with saving as many as 200,000 Jews. But people can still argue that we didn't do enough. The United States did not do enough. That's the one thing that really upsets me when you're reading about this, right? Especially when you're reading about this for the first time. The numbers weren't that staggering, right? The amount of people that were going to come into the new country wasn't that much, especially at the time of the United States, where, it's not nearly as big as it is today in terms of population. But, there was this sentiment, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. There's a lot of, racial Jewish sentiment in the United States at the time, right? Actually everywhere, as you could tell, right? The man I told you about who would sneak into Auschwitz, his story wouldn't get published, right, by any newspaper in Britain because they didn't want people to see that. Because, right, they would make them, right? The people, the population would make them try to free those camps instead of trying to actually win the war. Now, one can argue, right, if you go into Auschwitz and you free all the prisoners there, how many of lives would you have saved in 1942 on, right? Or if you would have bombed Auschwitz, right, yeah, most of the people there would have died, but you would have saved the lives of, hundreds of thousands of people that would have come eventually, right? So there's this argument of, what was the best thing to do? And ultimately, the Allies just didn't do anything. And they kind of waited for them to beat the Nazis, and eventually, right, it would kind of die out. That's what happened pretty much. The Allies respond to the Holocaust. Roosevelt organized the Evian conference to discuss the issue of Jewish refugees. However, neither the United States nor Britain took in substantial numbers of Jews, right? They took a couple hundred. The conference was seen as a failure, right? It was just a massive failure. Now, the liberation of the concentration camps, right? How were they freed? How would they be liberated? The Allies only became fully aware of the enormity of the Nazi genocide program toward the end of the war, as Soviet and American troops began liberating the camps. These liberators, hardened by war, were not prepared to see the piles of dead bodies, the warehouses full of human hair and jewelry, the ashes from the crematoriums, or the half-dead, emaciated survivors. Right, class? This is one of the things, right, when we talk about just the absolute terror of war and the absolute nightmares of World War II and World War I, were these battle-hardened men, right, these soldiers who were killing others in the battlefield, right? When they, the Soviets, whenever they actually finally made their way to Treblinka, when they finally made their way to Majdanek, they were not ready for this. No one's ready to see this. When you walk into a camp and you're seeing just the piles of bodies, right? The amount of death and disease and just this hellish landscape that they're witnessing, right? A lot of people didn't know what to do, right? That's one of the reasons why when we talk about, right, this last slide right here, right, the Allies didn't really take actions because they knew it was happening, right? But they didn't know the scale. They didn't know how many people were dying. Soviet forces were the first to liberate a major Nazi camp in Majdanek, Poland. The Nazis had been surprised by the rapid Soviet advance and attempted to destroy the evidence of mass murders by demolishing the camp. Well, halfway through the demolishment, right, the Soviets got there and were able to, like, free the prisoners. The summer of 1944, the Soviets also liberated Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. By January 1945, the Soviets also liberated Auschwitz. Since Poland was closer to Russia during Russia's advance towards Germany, right, the Russians were the ones that were liberating all of these camps because the United States and Britain were attacking on the other front. They were attacking on the Western front. They were attacking in France and Germany. So the Soviets, when they saw this, right, they're used to suffering. They're used to seeing people suffer. They're used to seeing death. They're used to seeing war, right? The war hardened. But nothing can prepare you for seeing what was happening in these concentration camps. And once again, class, there's videos, there's documentaries, there's photographs that you could watch to see and look at to really grasp just the amount of like this, right? This is a German doctor. I'm sorry, not German, a Soviet doctor, right? Starting to check up on some of the older members of Treblinka. I believe this is Treblinka, right? And stuff like this, just seeing the malnourishment and seeing just the withered away bodies and the people that are, right, dying of hunger, and people who are starving, and people who haven't had a full meal in years, right? And there's going to be other examples of that. I didn't really want to post too much pictures. Now let's talk about the impact of the Holocaust. 1945, not 1845. I'm sorry. In 1945, the Nazis had mask. Why does it say mask? The Nazis had killed some 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, roughly 2/3 of all European Jews. Nearly 5 million other people were killed as well, right? So it's not always, the majority, right? The majority of the people who died were Jews. However, they also killed a lot of other people as well. The scale and savagery of the Holocaust are unequal in history. The Nazi deliberately set out to destroy the Jews, not Jews. I'm so sorry, for no reason other than the religious and ethnic heritage today. The record of the slaughter is a vivid reminder of the monstrous results of racism and intolerance. As the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, worldwide support for an independent Jewish homeland increased. On May 14th, 1948, Jewish leader David Ben-Gurion proclaimed establishment of the State of Israel in the former British Palestine Mandate, side of the ancient Jewish Kingdom of Israel. Many displaced Holocaust survivors immigrated to Israel to make a new start. So this is going to happen after World War II. After World War II, after the Allies win, spoiler alert, the Allies win. All of these Jews who don't have anywhere to go, they're given by Britain, they're given a chunk of land in the Middle East where Israel is today. That's called Israel now, right? The country of Israel is, a new country that started in 1948, May 14th. And a lot of these Holocaust survivors are going to move and immigrate to that new homeland, right? They finally, after World War II, they finally have somewhere to call their own. Now, the prosecution of the Nazis, Jewish population in Europe, right, 6 million of them die. 50,000 men were convicted of homosexuality, and between 5 and 15 of them were sent to concentration camps. And that's another thing too. A lot of it was just like, hey, like, you're gay, like, you're going to go to concentration camp. There's no proof of any of this. A lot of it was used as an excuse for, political reasons, and stuff like that. And here, class, just to give you an idea of the amount of scope and just how absolutely mind-boggling this whole thing is, right? This is a massive aircraft carrier, right? Not aircraft carrier, sorry, aircraft hangar full of shoes. That's it, right? Hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes that were taken away from the Jews as they were herded into those camps, right? They were stacked up and kept for safekeeping. Why they kept them, no one really knows, right? But that's the thing the Germans did. Famously, they would cut all the hair of the prisoners as they were put into the camps, and they would keep it, and they would put it in buildings, and so on and so forth, right? They'll do this with the clothes as well. They'll take their clothes or take their belongings and they'll like keep them. They wouldn't destroy them. They'll just keep them for whatever reason. But here's just an example, right? So think of the hangar out there by the high school, right? The hangar outside, the Hatfield airfield, that big hangar, right? This is like 5 times the size of that, right? Full of shoes, right? Just, stuff like that people don't really think about. The quiz, the Nazi campaign against the Jews. Go ahead and answer these questions. Here's a hint, guys. It's going to be part of your next quiz. Okay. All right, class, that's everything. Hopefully it wasn't that depressing. I didn't really want it to be that depressing because of, everything going on, but I'll talk to you guys soon. Enjoy, be safe, wash your hands. Bye-bye.